part of our program. We have a number of faculty members from each of the core departments here in ILR to talk a little bit about what these departments are. And those labor relations people, they're always so disruptive. The classes that you might have available here in ILR, keeping in mind, of course, that there are lots of classes beyond ILR that you should also be considering. So let me start with Professor Hausknecht, who is representing the HR department. HR no. Vanessa and John represent those two concentrations. Okay.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Glad to be here to welcome you to this event and to talk a little bit about the HR&O concentration. So I'm in the Human Resource Studies Department. As Pam mentioned, my name is John Hausknecht. I teach HR classes in the Mylar program related to staffing organizations. I also do the HR Metrics and Analytics course. The department itself is about 12 faculty. We have folks at pretty much all levels looking at micro issues in their research around staffing, training, compensation. We have folks that are doing more macro work at the firm level, looking at strategy and firm level relationships between HR practices and firm outcomes. So really kind of span the gamut in terms of topic areas that we cover and that we teach. We have about 6 to 8 adjunct instructors as well. So just in HR alone, you have about 18 faculty members teaching different courses at any given time. So that's kind of an overview of the department. I mentioned some of the courses already. The core areas that I would consider for HR are staffing, training, and compensation. So those are going to be offered pretty regularly, sometimes twice a year, but for sure at least once a year. Sometimes offered as a 7-week course, sometimes as a full semester 14-week course, and kind of all combinations therein for those types of classes. Thinking of other classes that we've offered in the past, more on an elective basis, would be things like international HR. Professor Bott's doing a course on mergers and acquisitions this term, I believe, or maybe it was last term. And so, executive compensation would be another one that's offered on a periodic basis. But if you think of any topic area within HR, we'd probably offer it at some point or another in that 2 years that you would be here. Other things I can say about the department, we're closely connected to, we run our Center for Advanced HR Studies. We call it CARS for short. This is our partnership with industry, essentially, where we have about 60 partner companies that pay a membership fee to be affiliated with the center, and they tend to be Fortune 200 types of organizations. What they get out of it is an opportunity to come and recruit our students, which is great for you. What we get out of it is an opportunity to stay really closely connected to industry in terms of our research and in terms of understanding what companies are facing today in terms of our key topic areas that we study. So just a quick example of that, I'll be going to Chicago in 2 weeks or so for a working group on HR analytics. Got about 20 analytics folks from different companies all converging in Chicago to spend a day and talk about what the latest issues, challenges, and opportunities are for HR and workforce analytics. And so that keeps us grounded, connected to what's happening in industry. We bring that back to the classroom. We have guest speakers from those companies come in on a pretty regular basis. I'll have the workforce analytics person from JP Morgan in May to talk to the metrics and analytics class. And that's a regular feature of the courses, I think, that you'd see at the Mylar level. So I think I'll pause there. But that's kind of an overview of the department and some of the work that we do.
Do you want me to do O now? Is that easier?
Sure. So I'm going to change the order around just a little bit because I think it makes more sense to go to the O part of HR&O.
Sure. So I'm Vanessa Bonds, representing organizational behavior. OB is kind of related to HR, but it's a slightly more sort of disciplinary approach. So a lot of the professors in OB come from psychology and sociology and will often teach from our core disciplines. So we might talk about issues of the workplace like motivation and talk about what fundamentally motivates people. And the sociologists, on the other hand, would talk about like culture and then apply it to sort of organizational culture. So the intro OB course covers all those concepts: motivation, culture, change, diversity, And then there's a whole bunch of elective courses that basically delve into more detail about all those different things. One of the ones that I teach is negotiations. So we approach negotiations. There's actually a lot of offerings of negotiations in different areas and even different schools. Like you can take it at the business school, you can take it here. My particular approach comes from my background. So my research is in social influence, and we talk about specifically sort of micro level psychology of negotiation. But we still do simulations and all the things you do in any negotiation course. And to give you an example, we also bring in guest speakers. So last week I brought in a former NFL executive and former NFL president who talked about negotiating like player salaries and player contracts. So that was really interesting. And we also, to give you a sense of sort of the research that OB tends to be involved in. So again, we come from these disciplines. So I'm a micro OB person. So my background's in psychology. I do a bunch of lab studies, and I've actually taken on Mylar RAs to work with me on these lab studies. And then there are also people who go into organizations and do sort of more ethnographic, sociological sorts of studies and qualitative research and quantitative research in that area. Is there anything else you can think of?
That's good.
We'll have a chance for questions
Okay.
here, so that gives you kind of a flavor for that area. So let me turn it over to Professor Kuruvilla to talk a little bit about the labor relations and the comparative labor, international comparative labor, as two areas.
If I can get this to work. Yeah, okay.
We also study technology here, although we don't always practice it.
All right. So I'm representing this department, although I'm not a part of it, but none of them were here today. So we have a large number relative to everybody else about on history, every other competitor school. These are 4 of our historians, some of them who do labor history, some of them who do business history, and Louis Hyman is the author of a really interesting book about the history of consumption from Wedgwood to Walmart. So it's on one of those bestseller lists. Those are historians, offer a range of interesting courses that excite the mind, even if they're not directly related to, an HR career. We also have a lot of lawyers, and all the lawyers work. So Lance works on international comparative law, and you will take a class from him. Kate works on immigration law, and both Risa and Jim work on law and arbitration. Okay. We are a very strong school in dispute resolution, and when I say dispute resolution, I also mean conflict resolution. What we guys in labor relations and that side call dispute resolution, John House-Connect and his buddies call it conflict management in companies. It's the same thing, and she calls it negotiation, right? This particular group also has, like CARS, we have a Center for Dispute Resolution called the Scheinman Institute, and that facilitates the connections with practice, very well connected. And then there's a group that does traditional labor relations. These are mostly people who fall into all kinds of other categories as well, but some of them study labor relations in different industries, like the auto industry, the airline industry, and some of them study labor relations in different countries. Okay, healthcare, so healthcare is a big deal these days, and Adam Litwin, all of his research is on managing change in the healthcare industry. So it's labor relations, it's HR, all mixed together. Okay? And I'm transitioning. We also have a couple of unusual folks, especially Sam Nelson, who runs the Cornell Argumentation and Debate Society. There are lots of people, even in the MILR program, who are participating in debates, and they do this internationally. Cornell's debating team is ace high, really, really good. We also have people who work primarily for unions, like Kate Bronfman-Brenner, and we have Shannon Gleason, who does a lot of very interesting work on immigrant workers. And during these Trumpian times, her research has become highly relevant. Okay, transitioning to the international and comparative labor, which both Ginny and I are really part of, I thought I'd show you the mug shots, and then Ginny will give you the substance, right? And so we have people, the two folks at the top, Rose Bott, who's from HR, and Lisa Nishi, who's also from HR, are also in the international and comparative group. And what ties, they both work on global, international and human resource management, generally. Rose and I, on that axis, work on global management of global supply chains. Me and Lance together work on corporate social responsibility, and Lance and Alex Colvin together work on comparative labor law, right? So we're all kind of interconnected. And then we also have a geographic distribution. So Ginny and Lowell work on Europe, Maria works on Latin America, Eli and I work on Asia, and Eli works specifically on China, and Professor Boyer works on the United Kingdom, and Professor Fields, who's an economist, works on developing countries, on policy issues more broadly. So that's...
So did you want to speak to the concentrations?
I'll let you do this.
Oh well, I don't know about the labor relations and the
Okay,
the labor
so,
relations concentration
on the
and
labor
the
relations
public
side,
policy.
you can concentrate in collective representation, which means taking a series of courses on collective bargaining, which is required for all of you, but union organizing, and a variety of courses that are on collective representation, including studying global campaigns and so on and so forth. So that's one concentration. The second one on labor relations is dispute resolution. Series of courses of mediation, arbitration, a practicum in New York with the Scheinman Institute. And those are the two concentrations that are possible in the labor relations group.
And you might. What about your exciting project on global value chains?
My exciting project.
Yeah.
My exciting project is like John's HR department and its connection with the HR industry. We have a project here on global supply chains and labor standards and environmental standards in global supply chains. And as all of you know, you can't be a HR top boss these days of a global company without having some expertise in managing the global supply chain, right? Or managing labor relations in Europe, which is heavily unionized, for that matter. And so we have a large project here. We have a multi-stakeholder group with companies, unions, NGOs all involved. And we try to sort of push the dial on how do you make labor practices, improvements in labor practices and environmental practices more sustainable in global supply chains. And it's ongoing right now.
So I'm Virginia Dolgast, and I'm in that international and comparative labor group. As you saw from Sarosha's presentation, I focus on Europe, and I lived in Europe for 10 years, as well as various other times before actually living there. I worked at London School of Economics in the management department, and I was teaching on international HR degrees, as well as teaching international business briefly at King's College London. So I have a lot of experience on that side of the Atlantic. So just some background on the concentration on international and comparative labor. That's part of, I think the choices are to concentrate in HR&O or labor relations, public policy, or international and comparative labor. International and comparative labor really has two different parts to it. I think one side is developing a deep understanding of context and institutions. So what are the areas of labor market policy, national, legal, institutional, and cultural differences across countries that really affect the practice of HR in different national contexts, that affect the ability to actually implement the HR strategies that these guys are studying, as well as the possibilities, so the kinds of resources that you have in those contexts with your human resources, that operating within global firms and global HR, you really need to understand. Another side is to understand the global context of HR labor strategy. So not just understanding national institutions, understanding what it's like to be in China or operate a subsidiary in Europe, but to really think strategically about global firms and how they design and implement global strategies. Right? So students who come out of this concentration tend to go into areas like international HRM, or HR, labor relations in multinational companies. And certainly I know in Sarosha's classes you've had a lot of leaders who work in those areas within multinationals who are responsible for global labor relations or global HRM. But we also have students who go into work for international NGOs, are interested in working for the ILO or the European Commission, are working in some kind of area of working in global unions, global labor strategy in that sense. And within that concentration, you have students taking 3 classes then focused on a particular country or region, like Asia, China, Latin America, and Europe. And then 3 courses have to be focused on any other kind of comparative labor course, and we have a list of those. So those would include things like globalization and human resource strategies, corporate social responsibility, international labor law. We have some of the people Sarosh was talking about teaching classes on migration and international and comparative perspective. And so those provide you with the opportunity to have a deep dive into a particular context and have that regional expertise. And then on the other hand, to develop some of those more global international strategy, HR strategy or labor strategy skills.
Okay. So questions about the concentrations or the courses or faculty research? Fair game.
Mm-hmm.
Are all 18 faculty members in doing a research project or have an ongoing research project?
In HR?
Yeah.
So the 12 resident faculty would be tenure track or tenured faculty members. The 6 adjuncts are either going to be staff or practitioners, so they would not necessarily have an active research stream. But for your 12 resident faculty, myself and the 11 others, absolutely. And so that's where, I started by saying that we kind of cover the gamut of different HR topic areas and have ongoing multi-year research projects. I'll just share an example of one I have right now funded through the center. They did 3 large grant initiatives about 2 years ago for different topic areas within HR, and the one that I'm pursuing with a couple colleagues of mine is looking at the effects of mass layoffs on the performance, retention, and kind of business performance for, it's a large global manufacturer. I can't say the company, but we're looking basically at multiple years worth of data in multiple locations where they've either had or not had layoffs, and kind of looking at the human capital consequences for those who remain. So we know a lot about what happens to people who lose their jobs through layoffs, but not a whole lot about the consequences for the units themselves as they try to struggle to regain, footing and remain competitive. So that's been an interesting project. We've been out there to their location, I think 3 times now, doing interviews and kind of ground field work, and then we're now in the process of looking at historical data to then quantitatively kind of go after these questions. So I think you'd have examples from all the faculty in terms of what they're currently working on, all active researchers.
A follow-up question is the RAs. How's the process of how do you know how many RAs can a research get, and how do you get into those kinds of research?
Yep. So we do have an active PhD program in HR as well. So for research assistantships, most often they have guaranteed funding for their time here. So they would oftentimes be the first go-to for RA-ships, but as you might imagine, from semester to semester, needs vary, and so sometimes we have more RAs than we have PhD students, and then so that would open up to the broader MILR pool. Teaching assistantships is another possible source of funding, and same thing, same sort of process there. It's opened up to the wider pool. It is competitive, and the number of slots varies from semester to semester. But it's certainly an option. It's for the RAs, it's getting to know faculty, talking to them, and then when those opportunities come up, then kind of pursuing it with them.
Yeah, so relatedly, I was curious what the faculty in general find desirable in TAs in terms of what they're looking for, and in general, and also a little bit more specifically, selfishly sort of oriented. So I have zero experience with HR, and I'm not sure if something like that could militate against sort of possibilities for TA-ships. I have a background in clinical psych and the master's, and so I don't know if those could be leveraged, or I just don't know how the sort of general milieu of sort of achieving TA-ships is.
So I could probably, oh yeah.
The way that Mylars, as Professor Houskinet said, because we have the PhD program, and part of that involves training them to become faculty, so we also want them to be obviously TAs, but the demand for TAs often exceeds supply. So this is where you get to the Mylars, and it varies to some. So the way that it works is that faculty members select there's a matching process that goes on between faculty nominations and student request. And faculty often select people who have been in their class or that they've gotten acquainted through some other way. Sometimes people also, when they know there are not enough PhD students, will send out a notice or ask. There's a list that we keep in the graduate office of people who express interest in being a teaching assistant. So they will sometimes send out notes and then talk to students to try and get a sense of their background, there's a lot of intangibles that go into making a good teaching assistant, and so people are looking for those kinds of things.
I can speak a little more directly to your background because I teach the big intro OB class, which always needs 4 TAs, so I take on Mylars almost every semester. And I generally, because OB, again, a little more disciplinary, I have a psychology background, so I wind up looking for people who have more disciplinary backgrounds. Like if you understand the psychology I'm going to be teaching, that's helpful. And the intangibles are definitely, you're working with these undergrads, they're 18. It's been a while probably since you've been around 18-year-olds, but there's a certain way of dealing with them when they're brand new to college and away from their parents. So clinical psychology will always benefit you in that way.
I would just add the students that I've selected for TA-ships tend to be excellent performers in class. They're also conscientious. They're good with students. You can imagine them being reliable, responsive, all that kind of stuff.
And you should know, typically we assign teaching assistants to the bigger classes, so OB, HR, but LR that are also frequently big enough to merit a TA. The rule of thumb is that a class needs to have 50 students in order to be assigned a teaching assistant.
Yeah,
Did you want
to? Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say we have an MILR TAing right now with our globalization of work, labor, and capital class. And she took my HR outsourcing class the year before. I think I recommended her as somebody who would be a good TA in that environment. And so that's often how the matching process happens.
But in that particular course, which is team taught by 4 faculty members, it's about globalization of work and labor and capital, and we look for somebody with some degree of cultural fluency, somebody who at least understands 2 different countries and has had some experience. And so that would be one of the requirements.
Yes.
Question, do classes do TA or RA for should you first reach for classes that would relate to your industry or your field that you want to go after graduating, or does it really not matter? I mean, I know that it's great if you can do if it matches perfectly, but
I think my perception is that teaching assistantships are probably useful maybe in some very broad way for career progress, but mostly they're a way to sort of get through the program and not come out with a lot of debt.
But they also, my TAs have had amazing experiences TAing, just teaching for often the first time, so you don't need to have teaching experience. And they often find a real connection with the students and realize that they want to get involved in some other way.
Yeah,
and
no,
it
it's very
informs.
gratifying.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. But in terms of a career,
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So, sorry, you had your hand up for a while.
So for the students that are really interested in OB specifically, rather than the HR function as a whole, are they going into similar types of roles as the other HR students from your experience, or are they like on a separate, different career path based on your experience?
In terms of where they go after,
Like right
The
after,
degree?
but also like long term?
I don't actually, what do
It's
you?
the same. I mean, it's all one concentration. So for the most part, people go into corporate HR management or closely allied areas of management. I think the coursework in OB and HR is very complementary. It's slightly different focus, and in fact, actually all of the classes, you'll find that there's a lot of overlap, that because we're dealing with the same topics but from kind of different vantage points, which I think is an important part of your education, the educational experience. Yes?
Stand up so you can see me. A more abstract question. I would love to hear some adjectives that would describe successful students in this program from your experience.
Curious. Define successful.
Just to get a sense for, I ask this question because I do a lot of recruiting in my current job, and frequently people ask me a question like, describe the people who do well in this company. I'm trying to get a sense for, as you describe students here, do I align with them, or do they sound like something that I would do well in?
So I have a perspective on that. So I think, and you know, I think like a lot of students come here driven by a very instrumental reason. I do this program, I have access to a job. Obviously, that's an important motivation, right? So fine, but there's a little more to instrumentality once you get here. And that is being able to use the resources that the faculty here give you. And a lot of people, in so being instrumental, completely miss that, right? The advantage of coming to the ILR school is that we are the largest collection of scholars in the world who focus on work and the working relationship. And you know, when you're here, you're going to be participating in the production of knowledge as well as in its immediate consumption after being produced, right? And so that's the advantage of coming here. But you have to use the faculty, which means that, you know, instead of just focusing all the time on, okay, how do I get my next internship and what do I do? This is your last shot at a degree, at an education. And you get the education not just in the classroom, but when you talk to the faculty and you talk about, you know, and those are the discussions that enrich your career. I talk with a lot of MILR students who are not necessarily going into HR, and some who do, but who, you know, who are suddenly saying, maybe I could have done that, maybe I could have done this at the end of their 2-year program, right? I mean, I have a lot of MILR students in my course that I teach on China and India, right? I said, yeah, we should have taken this before because then we could have, right? So I think the curiosity that Ginny was talking about is also, but also the ability to use the resources here effectively. A lot of MILR students take the class and that's all. They see the end of the professor, it's finished.
Yeah, I would have said proactive, which kind of goes along with that.
I would have said entrepreneurial, which is kind of another word for the same
But,
thing.
I mean, if I think about students in my classes who've really thrived and gotten the most out of it, is students who bring their knowledge but are really curious about what other students bring. Because you guys are an amazing group of students who have these backgrounds from different countries, different companies. And I have a couple of undergraduates in my HR outsourcing class who say they feel a little intimidated by the amount of expertise and knowledge that's in there in the class. And just the ability of students to engage with each other and learn from each other is probably one of the big recipes for success.
Okay.
So my question was going to be somewhat in line with what Professor Kufula was saying, where some students come in and then they miss that because they're so focused on do my classes and then get a job. So what does that look like to avoid that? Like when you talk about using resources, so what should a student be doing so that they don't fall into that trap of just having that one track learning?
So I think it's a matter of being engaged. The university is a very, very exciting place, and not just the wider university. There's, at any given day there are at least 3 talks that you can go to the larger university. Most MILR students stay within ILR and forget that vast structure and activity outside. So what I'm saying is being engaged, I think, is key. People, and this is, Pam may kill me for saying this, but people spend a lot of time worrying about concentrations, I don't think that the recruiters care too much one way or the other, They're just sort of saying,
for saying that.
yeah, I don't know. But I think that the recruiters come here sort of knowing that you're all Cornell students, you've gotten in here, we've selected you. Whether you have one less course in HR or one more course in compensation, that's not important to them. What is important to them is you've received a great education. And you should do whatever you can to make that great rather than to sort of narrowly focus on just, X, Y, and Z compensation courses or X, Y, and Z dispute resolution.
Yeah, just add, when I've advised MILR students, I always want to get to know their backgrounds, because if you're coming in with 0 HR experience, I'm going to push you towards a few more electives in that open pool of courses you have to choose from. But if you already have a pretty strong psychology, HR type of background, I'm going to try to push you outside of ILR, get you to take classes that are going to stretch your comfort zone. If you have 0 business background, take a finance class. If you have a lot of business background, don't take any. That kind of thing. But just try to steer students to the right complements to their education so that you walk away thinking that you were stretched and enriched by being here as opposed to just being narrowly focused. I mean, the strength of having probably 15 different HR courses on the books, that we have that breadth and depth in the topic area, but it can lead to this. I took 4 courses, let me take that 5th and 6th one that are offered when you could be stretching by, taking something completely outside of HR. So those would be some practical things that I would recommend.
Okay, so we had, I don't think this is from the previous round, a question from an online student, which is going to be hard to answer. Would an MBA-MILR combination help international students find more career opportunities? And on average, how many students pursue MBA-MILR combination every year? In terms of the first, that's a hard one. I think Regina would be our career services, the woman who works. Have you met with her yet? Okay, she probably would be in a better position to answer that. I don't know if any of the staff at the back have a experience with saying, is it better, especially if you're an international student, to get so an MBA degree is a more standard degree. MILR is really specialized in HR. It seems logical that it might give you more opportunities, but I'm not absolutely positive. And most of the recruiting that goes on here is often for HR positions. So I'm not absolutely positive.
I think that the one thing that person needs to understand is that we have a different visa process for international students now, and where there's a visa lottery. So
that's true.
And so
that's going to make everything more complicated.
Company might give you a job. Companies do this all the time for international students. They give them a job. They see whether they get through the visa lottery. If they don't get through the visa lottery, then they sort of say, fine, you're going to our Dubai office or to our London office, but not the US office.
Yeah.
So that's important.
And in terms of the number of MILR MBA students, Mary, would you say maybe 3 or 4 a year?
I would say more than that. So I would say 5 is low and 10 would be high. 5.
Okay, so between 5 and 10. And my perception is the number has been sort of slowly increasing over the last few years. Maybe not. Okay, so I've done that. Now, yes?
So I'm coming into this, potentially coming into this program from a very kind of labor side. I worked as a union organizer and as a labor rep, worked with and against many HRC over the past year, depending on how you look at it. And I've talked to a few, I'm definitely kind of on the CR track, I think, and I've talked to a few CR students, which have helped a lot. But I am wondering from you guys, since it sounds like a couple of you, or maybe all of you, have kind of an HR focus, kind of what your impression is of a CR students through the program and what you think they get out of it. Obviously, I'm going to talk to them and some other professors, but just what you guys think that those students bring to the table and get out of the program.
Okay,
So
I'm not
I'm-
sure an HR focus is quite right.
Yeah, I don't consider myself in any way HR focused, but I'm labor focused, but in global supply chains as well as in companies, labor relations in companies. I think that we have a small number, percentage, in terms of a percentage of the incoming class, we have a small number of people who are clearly not going on to HR careers. And you know, who would like to sort of be perhaps a little different and a little broader. We have placed people in CSR global supply chains, at least 5 in the last 5 years. We have people who want to work in labor relations with companies, and then we have people who want to work with the labor movement. So there's a large number of faculty, as I showed you who are CR focused, and so I think the advantage is that you benefit from a lot of attention, right? And the courses that you take, you don't follow the standard courses that what do you call the bundle and so on. You know, you can have. So I think you have a wide range of courses that you can take, because the labor relations department is by far the largest. So.
I'd also, sorry, not to interrupt, but I would also say that, I mean, I said it in the beginning, but one of the nice things about the school is that it is this kind of dual mission. And I think that the LR students benefit from taking the HR and OB classes and kind of, well, first of all, you know, you have to run organizations regardless of whether you're on the labor side or the management side. So understanding those principles is actually very useful, but also just kind of perspective taking and things like that. I think that's an important part of your education. And the HR, likewise, benefit from taking classes. It's just a broader view of the enterprise that you're going to be involved in, which I think is very beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, we hear from recruiters all the time that they really like our students because they are well-rounded in that sense, whether it's, you know, however you're looking at HR, getting that labor relations experience or vice versa. So when I've had them in class, it's actually always been a nice compliment. And it's different from a business school in that sense, that we're studying the workplace from all sorts of angles and perspectives, as opposed to more, you know, coming at it from a business school vantage point.
Yeah, I would say I'm come from more of the labor relations side, but I actually did my PhD here and had a concentration in HRM, but ended up, I mean, it was mostly because I was working with Rosemary Bott, who is in HRM but has also a union background. She worked as a union organizer for many years. And so the courses that I teach bridge those two. I teach a class on labor relations in Europe, sort of European social model, and I've had a couple of Mylars in that class every year, actually who always came from the HR side and had worked for multinational companies based in Europe and really wanted to understand the European context in more depth. I had 2 Chinese students who worked for French multinational firms in China, and they wanted to understand why are French firms so strange, and when they talk about their context, their French context, what does it mean? And at the end of the class, they said, "Thank you, we really understand French companies much better now in an in-depth way." On the other hand, I teach this more HR-focused course on HR and outsourcing that brings in labor relations, and I think I have all of our labor relations Mylars in that class right now, which leads to a lot of very dynamic, interesting discussions between their focus on the labor relations aspects of outsourcing and the HR students who have in many cases managed the outsourcing process.
Right.
So I think that those 2 perspectives do come into a lot of the classes and make them hopefully more interesting for both.
I think where there's the greatest amount of mix between the HR stream and the labor relations people, they mix very well together. They come together well in the international side. And so that's where there is a lot of overlap.
Yeah, but I'd also say, so I'm teaching the Core OB, the spring semester version of it. And we have half are HR and O, and half are in, I think, CR, I'm not sure, another concentration. And, well, no, that's not the right proportions, because then we have a bunch of engineers. So you really do get exposed to a very different vantage point, and I think the mixture makes for great conversations and insights. So I think we are out of time, though. We go to 5, is that correct?
5:30.
Oh. Okay, I thought this was 4 to 5. Sorry, I don't have my little schedule with me. So yeah, then I won't cut it off. Are there other questions? Forgive me, for I have a bad habit of doing that, getting my timing off. Yes?
Definitely, looking around the room here, is the great geography, diversity of experiences. Do you find that students naturally are able to really cross paths, or in your classroom environment, do you purposely try and bring people together?
I'll say in negotiations, I mean, you're constantly talking with everybody else. I can't believe how quickly everyone is like learning everything about the other person as they figure out how to outwit them the next time they're paired with them. So it's been really fun to see sort of the relationships develop in that class. And so some of the more like interactive classes, there's definitely a lot of that.
Yeah, and I would say too that most of my courses, and I think in general, involve some group element, be it group discussion, group projects, group cases, and I'll rotate the membership of those groups. To me, as an outsider, you can talk to the students themselves, but it seems like a cohesive Mylar group, as a whole, that they identify with this program, with the things that we do in it, the courses. And so that's been my perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say in the bundle, if you take those courses, you are assigned to teams which are consciously mixed up, both in terms of your backgrounds, international, domestic experiences, and so forth. So there is actually an intentional effort to bring a mix together.
And Pam, there's this international society or international...
International Graduate Students Association.
Okay. I remember I went last year to their
Iron Chef
evening presentation, where all the international MILR students presented something about their country. And we had a dinner where people brought food from their own country, and there was this nice evening where we celebrated, including we had a group of Mormons who presented on the Mormon culture. I learned a lot about Mormon films.
And one year we had a guy from Florida talking about
So you can share your culture, even if it's American.
But the classes, the elective classes are very small. So there's no way out, I have just 15 students in front of me, and so everybody interacts. So once you get past the required ones that tend to be larger, then it's all pretty small classes.
Okay, you and then Lydia. Okay.
Yes, I had a question that hopefully is not indelicate. Given that it's a terminal master's program, I've had some experience at other schools in which when there's a terminal master's and that's the only degree, they sort of get the most faculty attention and priority. Whereas when there's also a PhD program, sometimes master's students tend to be less of a priority in that regard, just because the PhD students are working on the research projects with the faculty. So I wasn't sure what's the sort of typical interaction or what's the environment here at Cornell, given that there are PhD students and there's this terminal MILR program that's more professionally oriented, and how that sort of manifests itself in faculty-student relations.
Oh, we can each offer our own views. Yeah. Go ahead.
So from an HR standpoint, we have a small PhD program. We're admitting 1 to 3 students per year. So if you look across the 5 years, it typically takes, we have about 10 or 12 students. And like I said, about a dozen faculty. So they are not, it's not a scope and size where we're spending a lot of time and energy on them. In fact, we we sometimes say it's been a year since we've offered a PhD course. Might be time to do that. And so the Mylar courses, I don't know how many are on the books in a given year from our department, but I would guess in
A lot.
year, 15, you know, give or take. Whereas a PhD seminar, maybe 1 or 2. I've taught 3 PhD seminars, and I've been here, this is my 13th year. I've probably taught 30 Mylar classes, and then the balance would be undergraduate level. So it's definitely not the case that it's in this pecking order of PhD down.
I would say, I mean, so we also teach undergraduates, right? Which means that the faculty's attention are spread. There are some people who specialize in one level, like who really focus on the undergrads or the Mylars, or some who focus on the PhDs. But I think most of us actually, well, I'll speak for myself. It's actually, I like different levels and different things. So when I teach PhD students, the classes are wildly different from the professional masters. But I think I enjoy both approaches. They're different, you know, you're wearing different hats. But I don't think any of the programs get valorized one over the other. I think all the programs have kind of, like I said, they're champions or people who really like working with this level of students. But then there are a lot of faculty who span as well. So.
You can give, I think, just a potentially a hopeful perspective for the, I don't know how many labor-oriented or international and comparative labor students we have here, but in our PhD program, we've had small numbers in past years, and this year we had a deferred student and then several other who've accepted and are starting in the fall, and I think that will expand in part the community of people at your level who will be taking some of the same classes in the Mylar program, probably a few of them in ICL.
Mm-hmm.
So that could potentially also be a resource and part of the community for those students.
Also, the Mylars and PhD students have expressed interest in having more cross-interaction. I don't know what that means, but Lydia, and then we'll go to you, okay?
This is more of a question toward your expertise rather than toward why we should go to the school. What's in store for your concentration? What are the trends in the next 5, 10, 15 years? What's happening?
Do you need a crystal ball?
So I thought this was a question for you. No,
For
it's a general question.
General question or for HR or?
That's a general question. I'm asking because I'm interested in HR, but I don't exclude other concentrations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to what we hear constantly from our CARS board members, which is around how HR professionals continuously need to build their skills and capabilities to have conversations about the business and about what the organization needs to be successful and to survive. And so the language of business is numbers and data these days, and that seems to be pushing into HR. Not just because I teach this analytics course, but I really have seen an increase in interest in it in the last 10 years or so, where employers are almost wanting people to have had it now as part of the profession. But that's just one small example. I think there's lots of changes happening with globalization, diversity, talent shortages. All of these issues are things that we're going to talk about in class from a principle standpoint, not from kind of a fad and trend standpoint. So while we'll talk about what's on the front page of Fast Company, it's going to be from a foundational perspective where we have theory and research to come at that new issue or trend, and hopefully that's what lasts, not us talking about the latest buzzwords and things like that. So that's kind of my view on it.
I think content-wise, OB is in a lot of the same sort of content areas are growing, but right now, just to speak from sort of a disciplinary bent, there's sort of a crisis of methodology right now in micro OB specifically and psychology, just kind of looking at what research findings can we trust? How well have we been doing research all along? I mean, people get frustrated. They see news articles that say like this thing, and then a week later it's the opposite. And a lot of that can be traced to shoddy research practices that we're just now sort of soul searching about and trying to fix and uncover and come up with new analyses and things like pre-registration. So there's a very sort of like empirical revolution happening at the micro OB level, trying to make sure that when we put research out there that goes in the OB textbooks and HBR articles and you guys read, that it's actually meaningful and replicable and applicable. So I'd say if there's one sort of major thing that's going to change over the next few years is I hope the research is going to get better and we're going to have more stringent sort of research practices. And we'll sort of identify the things that are good advice and the things that are just like fluff in HBR articles.
Which also ties into what John was saying about analytics.
Yeah.
I mean, I think practitioners face the same sort of pressures to give valid information and to deal with information in a way that's sophisticated, relatively sophisticated.
I think on our concentration, despite Donald Trump, who is retreating rather than pushing globalization, I think the world is still going to be very global. And we would like to see our students who take the international concentration, and many students concentrate in HR and international at the same time, to sort of demonstrate a lot more cultural fluency. For those of you who are definitely getting into HR, but most degrees, other concentrations, I bet 5 years from now you're not going to be in this country, right? And so, so I think we've already made a change in the concentration to sort of say if you're taking language, which is again your last shot to learn another language.
It's not your last shot. You make it sound terminal.
Going to work. Make use of it. We offer the largest concentration of languages that almost any other university offers over here. Right? So, so yeah, so our concentration is going to sort of evolve in the direction of, can you at the end of it demonstrate the cultural fluency, the global mindset, and perhaps the language.
I think just as a small addition, from teaching this HR outsourcing class, I've invited a lot of guest speakers, and so in addition to my own research, which has looked at outsourcing, I've spent time with CHROs and people working within global companies managing outsourcing relationships or being involved in them in some way. And they emphasize and hammer home how important it is for HR professionals to have some fluency and understanding of HR as not just occurring within an organization, but increasingly HR functions and roles are distributed across many different organizations. And so those jobs in HR involve very complex negotiation tasks because you're not just negotiating and planning within your own organization, but across these boundaries. I think that's next big area.
Yes, sorry.
I just want to piggyback off that last conversation. You mentioned talent analytics and metrics. What role does stat methods play, mostly in the HRO concentration, but more broadly in the MyLR degree? And could you speak on, if any, about HCA and BR talent analytics?
Sure.
Grad Student Association?
Yes, so most of those I can speak about. I'm the faculty advisor for the talent analytics group. And then the first piece is the role of stat and methods in workforce analytics. So we have a required stats course, kind of foundational. It's going to be, formulas and problem sets, that kind of an approach to learning the fundamentals of statistics, which is a good refresher if you haven't had it in a while. But analytics is really a lot more than that. I mean, I talk about this in class that the measures and analysis is just one piece of kind of a broader change. It's usually a change effort. And so you kind of up front have to know what it is you're looking for and what the logic is of even getting into the data. And then of course the measures and the analysis are important. You should know that piece too. But then there's a back end of what you actually do with it and how you drive change and measure or track progress towards some broader organizational goal. So there's a need for the deeper stats and methods if you're going to work in an analytics group, centralized workforce analytics team. But for your average HR professional, at least my focus in the class is to equip you to be a good consumer and user and occasional doer of analytics. if you came here saying, I want to work in one of those centralized analytics teams, then I would encourage you to take additional stats classes, database management, some computer science types of classes, do independent studies where you can work with data sets in HR and really go a lot deeper. Given the degree and given how much time you have, we just don't go to that level of depth, but so that's a little bit about that piece. And then the group was started a few years ago by some interested students who really wanted to do more on talent analytics and put together a student organization where they would do occasional guest speakers or panel discussions, try to gain some additional experience working with company data sets. And so if you haven't met any of those current members, I could put you in touch with them to tell you what they're up to currently. But that was the idea of that group, was to start a student organization that would go a little bit deeper on the topic.
And if those are your interests, I mean, there are classes in biometrics. Emily Zytek in our department teaches data analysis. There are lots of classes around campus that you can use to build up that background. You had your hand up.
So in undergrad, I had the opportunity to take a course on China and India, and then actually go visit there over winter break. And then I sat in on Professor Grasso's class this morning. It looks like he took 2 students to Costa Rica. Do any of you offer like international opportunities or hands-on experience similar to either of those?
Yeah, so it kind of varies based on which of us has children, and we can take time off from the December vacation to take students out. I think there's a course coming up. I think next year, Maria's course on migrations, which will have a travel component associated with it. The course I teach on global labor practices, is going to have a travel component associated with visiting the factories of Nike and Gap, in Vietnam, the next time I teach it. So there are, but then they don't happen with the regularity that we would like, given that our teaching schedules vary every semester, our personal lives vary every semester. But it is definitely a focus of the university to increase those courses, and depends on which one of us steps up.
I'm not sure if maybe you know what class this was, but I have a couple students in my class who are in another class where they're doing like a consulting project for a company that's going to wind up flying them to, tour their company. And so is that I think it's an HR class.
Could be. The HR consulting class has done that in the past. It's historically, I think it's been mostly domestic travel, but, go to a Goodyear plant in Ohio and see actually what you've been working on in terms of your class project and how it's playing out on the factory floor. And that's going to vary too, and maybe this time it is international, but I'd echo what Sarosh said, that these are, they're not consistent, that we always take this class here, but there's enough of us doing it that there's typically something happening on a pretty regular basis.
There are also exchange programs. Did they talk to you about that yet?
They're going to talk to us about that tomorrow.
Okay, so in France and in Ireland and some other places. So for a semester you can go, which is a little different from an internship. You're just taking classes, but living in a country, I think that it's a valuable experience as well.
Internships are also an opportunity. Some of our students have gotten internships that have been in other countries. Or a student advising is going to do an internship at the European Trade Union Institute from the union side this summer, doing research on European labor issues.
Right. We've had people do internships at the ILO and other organizations like that. Did I see more hints? Sorry, I have to share. Yes.
So I know research funding is tricky, and I'm not sure how it works at Cornell, but does the research that get funded usually based on the professor interest, or is it like things that are happening in the field in general? And is there cooperation? I was in a research team that was able to participate in Mini Labs 4 recently, so I found that really interesting, the cooperation across the country and across states, and that was just like brilliant to me. So I was sort of wondering how the research here worked, and if there was that cooperation aspect to it with other schools and other states.
The funding, like for a project in general, or like for a research assistant?
No, for the project in general.
So, I didn't quite get the question. Is it funding for projects that students do?
No, so the funding for the research that you guys do, is it based on your interests, like the?
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that the primary, motivation for faculty to do research on something is because they really are passionate about it, and so that's why we do the research. And there's a whole range of funding opportunities. Some of us get grants from foundations. Some of us get grants from companies. Some of us get grants or work with consulting relationships with unions. Some of us make money consulting, and that money is used to sort of fund research. There's a whole range of different ways in which these projects are funded.
Yeah, some lab research, good amount of lab research happening in the ILR school, and so that's going to be a different sort of funding strategy or model. And I think you're going to see the variability too in working with people from different universities. Some of us work with people from all over globally. Some stay right here at home and do our own work with graduate students and don't really have that partnership. So I think it's going to vary, but you'll see all combinations of models in terms of funding sources and research type and the amount of collaboration.
Okay, you and then you.
I know obviously people who pursue the MILR are doing so. It's obviously a professional degree with the expectation to go work. In your guys' experience, do students ever kind of have a twist of fate almost and decide to maybe go into academia, whether it's in ILR or PhD in some other program, and does that vary based on what you're interested in? Or?
Yeah, there's always a couple of people in the MILR program who suddenly forego the instrumentality for the passion and decide to apply to a PhD, and either here or somewhere else. And yeah, it's quite a regular occurrence, I think.
It's harder to, so the selection process, you have to apply to here to the PhD program, so it's completely, you're just kind of restarting. But we've had people do it, occasionally. It's not common, I would say, but it does happen.
I mean, when I was doing my PhD, Danielle van Jaarsveld had started as an MILR student and moved into the MS PhD degree in her second year. And you've already taken a lot of the classes here, and so I
and the PhD program is very different. I mean, there are no required courses, so it's, like I said, that's why it's a whole different application process and everything.
I think, in a class of 60, I'd say 2 or 3 have an interest, and then maybe 1 or 2 end up applying, and maybe 1 every couple of years or so comes here.
Or even less.
Or even less, 1 every decade, maybe.
Okay, so you and then you, okay?
Yeah, so I had sort of another prognostication question, in particular related to the HR concentration. So I was wondering your guys' input on if there's cause for concern about maybe significant job destruction for the sort of professionals in HR based on technological innovation, in particular, like the advances of AI and like the deep learning neural networks, which has kind of worked its way into eliminating some jobs in accounting and law, and I think most recently, I've seen a little bit in HR. So I don't know, is that a legitimate concern? If so, or if not, should it impact maybe career trajectories that we consider if we're thinking of doing that HR concentration?
Yeah.
This is another crystal ball one.
Yeah. A lot of that job destruction has already happened, I would say, in HR around administrative functions like payroll and benefits and a lot of the things that have been automated. So what's left now are these HR issues around talent and solving talent-related problems that are really difficult to do. I mean, we've had, aids to recruitment like LinkedIn and other technology support to do the recruitment work, but I'm just not sure we're at the point yet where we can go humanless on a human resources profession, right? But the real issues are things we talk about in class. You know, in my staffing class, we do a segment on automation, and I show videos of how some companies have literally replaced 400 workers with robots, and so those jobs are just gone. I think that's happened to some extent in HR, but what's come up behind it then is a need for a different skill set that can deal with this kind of modern workplace. So I think the employment projections at BLS are still really strong for HR. If you go on there, last time I did it, I remember they were kind of above a lot of professions in terms of the trajectory. So
I think in addition, the O part of HR is important here, because once you sort of outsourced and offshored everything that's transactional, it leaves a few things, strategic HR, but I think that it also allows HR to reclaim an area that it got rid of long ago, and that is organizational change. And HR people ultimately then tend to become the guardians of the organization's culture, and and so that's where this linkage between HR and OB is really crucial.
When I was at LSU, we had the head of Google People Operations, Laszlo Bach, come to talk to the students, and he was definitely recruiting an army of people to do top HR analytics for the company. He was a big proponent to the role of HR in driving culture and important strategic role in improving productivity, and saw that as the future of the profession. Yes.
So my question was for Professor Barnes, but maybe someone on the panel can answer. And it's sort of related to what John was asking. That if you're someone who come in and you decide that, I think I want to go to doctoral level, like in industrial and organizational psychology, would you say this degree is a good foundation for that? Because when I was thinking about grad school, in my head it was going to be master's and that's it. But now there's something happening. And I'm starting to look at, could this be also a good pathway to start looking at PhD programs in industrial and organizational psychology? And I don't know if this program is a good foundation for that.
It's a good question. I mean, I think in terms of a credential, when you're applying to PhD programs, we're not looking so much for credentials as much as experience with research and sort of knowing what you're getting into, at least when I think about like organizational behavior PhD programs. So if that was in the back of your mind as something you might want to eventually do, I would try to get involved in research as soon as possible. Because at the end of the day, that's, at least when I look at applications, I'm not looking at necessarily like, oh, a master's doesn't do anything for me. I'm like, oh, this person has done research, they know what they're doing, they know what they're getting into, they have a passion for a particular topic that'll sustain them for 5 or 6 years. So it's really those kinds of qualities that you can reveal in 2 years in the Mylar program. It's not so much the actual Mylar credential. That would be my sort of take on it.
Yeah. That's consistent. I mean, like I said, they're two very different programs. PhD and professionals. So.
And coursework rarely transfers, so you would have to view it as getting that credential to be familiar with the profession, but then the research is very different, right? Now you're really focused on one area and you're writing original work.
Yeah, and it's not that the topics are so different, but when you're trying to convey information to students who are going to be using it for practice, it's a very different a project than trying to just think about, could this be true? Do we believe this? And how am I going to study it? Which is more the PhD. So, okay. So I think we now have a reception.
Sure, yeah, so we have a reception.
This has been a production of the ILR School at Cornell University.